What's up guys, Kevin from Epic Gardening here. Today we're taking a look at this Peperomia obtusifolia. It's basically a peperomia propagation guide. I'm just going to use this particular plant, and the reason I'm using this particular cultivar is because if you see how it's grown, it's a little bit unkempt. It's kind of coming out in these odd directions, and peperomia is a fantastic plant to propagate to showcase different propagation methods. I've done some research, and peperomia has totipotency, or basically the ability to produce roots via many different cutting techniques. I'm only going to go over a couple because I find them to be a higher probability of success, but you could in theory take what's known as a split leaf cutting, where you're taking just the top or bottom half of the leaf. So that would be if I was to clip one of these leaves off and just cut it in half with a nice sterile cutting tool. You could actually get roots out of that. You can get roots by simply taking a leaf without the petiole, which means without the little section of stem connecting the leaf to the main stem. You could take a straight up leaf cutting, or you can take, I've talked about this before, a stem tip cutting, which is one of the highest probability of success cuttings in my experience for many different types of plants. And what that one is you would be taking off, let's say this section right here, and then just pruning that leaf off, and then you'd be rooting this and this entire stem tip. And that, at least in my layman's botanical knowledge, seems to work really well just because more of the plant is intact, and it really seems like the roots produce a little bit more vigorously. But what we're going to do today is we're going to give this a bit of a haircut and propagate it in my EZClone, which is basically just a water propagator. So you could also, if you don't have one of these, or you don't really know what this is, it's an aeroponic propagator, just sprays water at the bottom of the roots. So it's kind of like water propagation on steroids, but for all intents and purposes, just use something like this. You could put it in a little glass jar, be perfectly fine. So let's go ahead and take our cuttings, and we're gonna root them and see how it does. So the first cutting we're gonna make is over here on this one. We're gonna do a stem tip cutting, and I basically just need enough plant material, let me show you, to make it through this neoprene collar. So it's about 3/4 of an inch. So I don't want to take too much because that's more structure for the plant to support as it's rooting. I want to take just that right amount. So I'm looking right below this leaf node right here. I'm thinking about making a cut right there, and I think that's going to do really, really well. And eventually I'm going to have to take some of these extra leaves off, because that's a little bit, that's just a lot of life for the plant to support as it literally was cut off of its life support, right? And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this leaf off, and lo and behold, this opens up the opportunity to make more than one cutting out of this, because we're going to do a stem tip cutting here. But remember, I said peperomia can be done with a leaf petiole, which is basically this section plus the leaf. And so I'm going to take 2 of these off, and we can also experiment with that. So we're going to cut this one off, and we are also going to cut this one off right here. So let's do that. And let's prep our stem tip cutting first. So we have 2 nice leaves. There's even like the early budding of new growth, so that's going to be perfect. I'm going to place this into my neoprene collar, but again, if you just have a jar, put it in a jar of water. It's completely fine and perfectly preferable to do it that way. I am not going to use rooting hormone right now, simply because I found that the success rate doesn't drop too much, and especially with the water propagator that is spraying at the bottom, it seems to just wash off relatively quickly, and I'm not sure of the efficacy of it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do it just like this. You can see it's made it all the way through. The growing node where the roots will come out is below the collar, so it's gonna be hit by that water. We're gonna be fine. Let's put that in. And what we'll do now is I will take these 2, since these are leaf petiole cuttings, and I will stuff these in. So it's gonna be a little bit more awkward because I have to get it all the way down there. But as long as it's coming out, we should be fine. So I'm going to try something like that, which is just a little awkward, but I think it should work. So we'll do that. We'll stuff that one in there, and then we've got this one here. We're going to do the same thing. And I would like to make a couple more cuttings, because in effect what I'm doing is I'm just pruning that Peperomia obtusifolia, because it's a little just unkempt, and I would like it to be a little bit more under control. And so in my pruning efforts, I'm effectively creating new plants, which a lot of the times in the edible garden as well is what you're doing. When you're taking cuttings of your basil and using it in your kitchen for some pesto, you're oftentimes also creating new growth, which is really fantastic. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's see if we can see this in the camera. We can. So I'm going to go ahead and take off one of these side shoots here that's getting just a little crazy. So this one here is getting a little wild to me. I'm going to go ahead and take this cutting off right about there. So we have this one to work with. And for now, I think that's okay. One thing I also like to do is, since I'm cutting right below the leaf node, on a plant that's remaining, I'm leaving a little bit of extra stem that's really not going to do much. So I also tend to take that chunk off of the main plant just to prune it and tidy it up just a little bit. So I just take that little chunk off and it's a little bit cleaner. So now our parent plant is looking at least a little bit more sculpted. Certainly it's still overgrowing a little bit, but that's fine. We're going to go ahead and put that one down. Let's fish out our cutting here. And so again, we can take a stem tip cutting, which is this main piece, and then we can also take 2 more leaf petiole cuttings. And what we're going to do is toss all of this into our propagator. We'll wait a couple weeks and see how it goes, and then we're going to go through. So by the end of this video, you will see the actual potting up of our successful, hopefully successful, propagations. So let's go ahead and stuff these in here. Again, this is kind of an awkward way to do it. A lot of the times when you're taking a leaf petiole, what you would do is you would actually just put that in potting mix, which you certainly can do. But I'm gonna see if I can root it. As long as this section is touching the water or is being touched by the spraying water, I think we should be completely fine. And you can see that it is right there. So I think let's go ahead and take that gamble. But we're gonna check back in a couple weeks, guys. And if you like these propagation videos, please let me know down in the comments. I'm really having fun experimenting with this. It seems like you guys really enjoy it too. So if there are any other plants you'd like me to propagate, drop them down in the comments down below and I'll see what I can do. But for now, I will join you back here in a couple of weeks. It is day 3 on our Peperomia obtusifolia. Let's go ahead and check in. So we have some baby roots forming right there, just about to start. The showstopper in 3 days is this guy right here though. So he's got some roots coming out, 2 actually, 3 actually it looks like. Now let's take a look at our leaf cuttings and see if those did anything yet. It looks like nothing so far, which was the hypothesis. I felt like those would be slower just because you're not giving them as much tissue to generate roots from. I feel like for some reason it feels like it's a little bit harder for them to do it. But we're gonna come back, check in a couple days, see if these have gotten any roots, and check on the progress of these. Okay, we have transported outside. We have our Peperomia cuttings that have sent out some nice little roots. I wanna see if I can get them into their new pot pretty soon. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this little plastic pot, as I spill dirt all over my face, and pot up these 2 guys. Now, the ones that were a little bit more robust of cuttings obviously did a little bit better. So all the leaf cuttings only have still yet to develop roots. We'll see. It looks like they might be. I'm gonna let these go a little bit longer just to experiment, but these 2 guys are ready to go. So let's go ahead and get them in the ground. I'm gonna use a standard potting mix here. Looks like we're a little shy, so let me grab a little extra. Okay, so we have our 2 cuttings here. Let's take them out of their neoprene collars. We've got this guy right here with 3 little offshoots coming out, as well as this guy with a little bit more of a robust root structure. So what we'll do here is I'm gonna pot them to about there or so. Really make sure that the roots are nice and deep and firm in there. I'm gonna take our little dibber, just make 2 depressions here and right here. And we're gonna get these in there nice and snug. Just be very tender with them. There we go. That one looks decent. We'll compress that soil around it. Remember, you wanna make sure that those air pockets aren't surrounding the roots, so they're not just sitting in air and struggling to do their job here. So we've got these potted in. Now we wanna make sure, remember these have been water propagated, so they're very much used to a moist and wet environment. So we're gonna go ahead and water these in pretty gently, but make sure they get a nice good drink. And we can let these sit for a little bit until they really take root in their new home. They've of course already rooted, but we want them to transplant successfully and really establish themselves. So our leaf cuttings for our Peperomia also rooted, but they rooted much, much slower. That being said, they're still viable. We can still use them, and we are going to use them. We're going to pot these up into some potting mix. The roots don't look amazing, I will be honest with you. They're not quite as bright white as I'm used to seeing, but that being said, I'm curious, is this going to work? So we're gonna pot these up and let's see. Okay, our cuttings are out, and honestly the roots look a little better than I expected. When I was showing you guys earlier, they were kind of like just an off hue to them. They look actually pretty good. So what we need is some potting mix. I use some standard potting mix. It's a little bit more water retentive than some of the other ones I've used because it's a self-watering mix, so there's a little more like peat moss or coconut coir in there. Should be perfectly fine. Got a little stick to help depress and make a hole. I'm gonna use some fertilizer here, and this is a mycorrhizal inoculant fertilizer. So it is a 523, which is the NPK numbers, but also there's some mycorrhizal fungi in here that's gonna help form an association with the roots early on and really help them access that water and nutrition. So whole different topic, but it works pretty well in my experience, so that's what we're gonna do. This process is fairly simple, guys. So it's not too difficult if it's your first time doing any kind of propagation. I'm actually gonna use the back of this to make a little depression. We'll try to keep them a little evenly spaced apart. So we'll do a little dominoes 4 pattern here. We wanna make sure that we sprinkle our fertilizer in there. This is one that you don't have to worry about burning the plant roots or anything like that. It does require root contact because if you're gonna make a mycorrhizal relationship with the roots, of course, you need to be somewhat close to those roots. So we'll sprinkle that in. I'm gonna use this to just kind of whisk it around. This, by the way, guys, is not necessary. So if you don't have this, don't stress out. Totally not necessary, just something I'm gonna experiment with. I'm just gonna make sure I have complete root burial, and we'll place all of ours in here. Really interesting the way these develop in basically 0G kind of. They're not developing in soil or even water, they're developing in air in that aeroponic EZClone system. So the way that the roots kind of spread out is really unique, isn't it? Okay, so now we're going to gently cover around the roots. After this, it's basically time to water it in. I like to give this a nice little depression just to make sure that there's soil and root contact throughout all of this. Sometimes you can leave these air gaps, and if you leave the air gaps, it's a good way to put your plant off to a bad start. So what I'm gonna do is just give this a nice little water in. Make sure it soaks up really nicely. Since this has not been hydrated before, we're gonna give it a nice healthy water. And these roots are used to being in a more hydrated environment because of the way that they propagated, water propagation style. I'm gonna do that. I'm just gonna make sure that I'm not covering any of these leaves with any extra dirt. So we'll just wipe that off if we can. Wiping it off will help it photosynthesize. There we go. Just give it a little TLC. This one is a damaged leaf. We'll see. You know, it was one that I needed to take off anyways because I didn't like the look of it, and I just wanted to give it a nice prune. So if it takes, it takes. If it doesn't, not a big deal. It's part of the fun of gardening, is finding out if things that you think will work will actually work, or if they'll work for you. Okay, there we go. It's been a couple of weeks, guys, and everything rooted. Perfect success. You can see if I was to tug on these, they don't slip out at all. They're very clearly rooted in there and rooted pretty solid. Now, I will say, if you're doing a leaf cutting versus a stem tip cutting, you can see that on my stem tip cuttings, there is new growth, and it's just quite a bit more rapid than the leaf cuttings. I'm actually not 100% sure that leaf cuttings will create new growth. They will root and propagate, but I'm not certain that they actually have enough to create new growth. Jury's out on that one. I know that there's an answer somewhere. If anyone has any experience, definitely let me know in the comments down below. But I've been propagating a bunch of other different types of peperomia. It's a fantastically easy propagator. And I would say, as the conclusion, if you want to guarantee easy propagation, quicker, and that new growth is going to come out at a relatively quick pace, I would very much encourage you to do a stem tip cutting, which would be, of course, taking something like this off, taking something like perhaps this right here off, instead of just a leaf petiole cutting. Now, if you have any other things you'd like me to propagate, of course, drop them down in the comments down below. We're building kind of a crazy propagation playlist here on the Epic Gardening channel, which I'm more than happy to do. I would love some suggestions for edible propagating as well. And until next time, good luck in the garden and keep on growing.